From Washington, live coverage of the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North at the Iran-Contra hearings. Here is Peter Jennings.
Good afternoon. Day 5 of the Iran-Contra hearings. The members of the Iran-Contra committees asking questions themselves, or in some cases, after all these hours of sitting and listening, now getting their own views on the record. The Colonel has already been questioned by 2 congressmen and 3 senators this morning. There are 18 more individuals to be heard from. What this is, as you will have seen if you joined us this morning, is an opportunity after all of the core testimony, at least we think all of the core testimony, has been elicited by the various councils, is to see the Colonel and Congress, i.e. to see the Colonel and the people's representatives interact directly. The Colonel back in the Senate caucus room. His wife, Betsy, has been with him again today, and ABC's Britt Hume is there for us. Britt, you were saying just before we went on the air that we thought we'd exhausted the subject of these, did the president see a memo or not, or at least we think we won't fully understand it till we hear from Poindexter. What's your sense of what we're getting now?
Well, Peter, we've had a complete change in the atmosphere, of course, from last week. Now that the members have taken over, they've obviously noticed what has happened, and that is this phenomenon of Lieutenant Colonel North's remarkable acceptance by the American public, and he's being treated very carefully. I think also, Peter, we had a shift in tactics, as you suggested earlier. Members have realized that if you ask this man a question, you open the floodgates, and he will present articulately and forcefully his view of things. And I think members feel that he has succeeded in getting a free ride before the American people on the whole case for the Contras and the case for Oliver North's innocence. And I think that they feel that there are countervailing views that many of them would like to express, and you saw that done this morning, I thought, with special eloquence by Senator Mitchell, later also by Senator Sarbanes expressing some of the same sentiments. Colonel North, I noticed, listened very quietly and appeared indeed even to be moved by some of what Senator Mitchell had to say. So it has been an interesting shift in the atmosphere.
Well, Senator Mitchell said, among other things, that his plea to Colonel North, who is indeed often pleading to others, is that you remember that for an American to disagree with you and still love God and country is possible. And Senator Mitchell, among other things, pointed out that it was his sense that God did not particularly take side in American politics, that disagreement is not necessarily evidence of a lack of patriotism. Britt, you mentioned the impact that the Colonel has had on the American people who watched him over the last week. A ABC News poll, which we finished conducting on Sunday night, finds that 19% of the people we asked actually believe Colonel North is an American hero. He's been so described by the president. But 64% believe that he is a victim, and 8% believe he is a villain, and 84% believe he is telling the truth, which is a rather interesting jump, because after his first day's testimony, 58% believed he was telling the truth. Here is the chairman, Senator Inouye.
Complete the questioning of the witness before us, Colonel North.
Chair recognizes the distinguished majority leader from the House, Mr. Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Colonel North. Colonel, you've testified, I believe, that from 1981 until your dismissal on November 24th by President Reagan, as a staff officer of the National Security Council, you did not undertake any activities except on the express authority or approval of your superiors.
That is correct, sir.
Directing your attention to the period of 1984 to 1986, at that time, it was either Mr. McFarland or Vice Admiral Poindexter that was the National Security Advisor. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in all major activities that you undertook, is it fair to say that Mr. McFarland or Vice Admiral Poindexter was your superior?
Yes, sir.
And other than that, your superior as a national security officer would have been the president himself. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct, but I happen to believe strongly in the chain of command, and I reported to my superiors. When Don Fortier was alive and was my immediate superior, I reported through him, or directly as instructed to either Mr. McFarland or Admiral Poindexter.
So there was a chain of command, but it was, in fairness, a limited one between you and the president.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct? You received, as you've testified, information from Mr. McFarland that the President wanted you to keep the Contras together body and soul as a viable fighting force. Is that true? Is that a correct statement?
I believe that my characterization was that the President had clearly stated that that was our objective as a part of the process of bringing about a democratic outcome in Nicaragua.
But when
Mr. McFarland tasked me to be the person who was the principal action officer, if you will, in that regard. Yes, sir.
Did you understand that that was an instruction which was being passed on directly from the President, or Mr. McFarland's decision as to who should be the operations officer for that?
I clearly understood that to be what the President's desires were, sir.
That he had singled you out through Mr. McFarland for that?
No, I don't necessarily mean to infer that the President said, look, Bud, I want Ollie to do this and nobody else. I clearly understood that Mr. McFarland wanted me to be the person who was the point of contact.
When did Mr. McFarland give you that instruction? Do you recall?
No, but my sense would be that it was coming off the conclusion of the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America, which had begun in 1983, and by the time that concluded, I, having been the National Security Council staff representative to that effort, clearly had established, perhaps with the designs of others, I do not know, but sufficient contacts with the resistance and with the governments in the region who were being helpful to the resistance.
How were these special implementations of this policy conveyed to you? Did Mr. McFarland task you specifically to do these things, to provide for financial assistance and to provide for military delivery of weapons and resupply and so on?
I would guess that the very first requirement was to go down and establish discreet contact with the resistance, and I did so at a period in time when the CIA was still the authorized entity of the U.S. government to provide that kind of contact. I was introduced to the leadership of the resistance by the CIA, and there came a time when the CIA began to wean itself away as a consequence of reduced funding availability, and that by the time the Boland proscriptions of October, the most rigorous of them that we've now come to call the Boland restrictions, came to effect, I was the person left in contact. Mr. McFarland was the person who turned to me to establish the initial resistance account offshore to which money was sent by a foreign government.
He specifically directed you to do that?
Yes, sir.
And that was the so-called Lake Resources account?
No, sir. That was in 1984. I asked one of the resistance leaders to establish an offshore account to which money could be provided by a foreign government.
Did you specifically direct the establishment of the Lake Resources account?
I don't recall saying that I wanted called Lake Resources. As a consequence of the discussions I had with Director Casey, with the concurrence of Mr. McFarland, the offshore entities as part of the overseas non-U.S. government activities were established by General Secord. I don't recall that anybody in the U.S. government mandated that it be called Lake Resources or anything like that.
You testified from time to time about your relations with Mr. Casey, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, as a friend and a teacher and so on. Did you ever consider yourself under his direction as Director of the CIA?
No, sir, I did not.
You were never under the authority of or under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency, any of its officers or the director?
No, sir.
But sometimes you took discussions with Mr. Casey to Mr. McFarland and recommended policies to him that had been suggested out of your conversations with Mr. Casey?
I did, and with Admiral Poindexter.
And you were always, did you always await their approval before you undertook such actions?
It's certainly my recollection that I did, yes, sir.
Sometimes, however, you acted on the basis of not receiving a disapproval, isn't that correct?
The expression that we used, Congressman Foley, was unless otherwise directed, I will proceed as follows, and I did so.
And there were whatever time lapses you considered to be appropriate before proceeding, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In any of these activities that we've discussed, the establishment of the accounts or the solicitations, the development of the resupply activities, providing of arms to the Contras. Did you ever have any direct confirmation from the President that it was his intention that you carry out these activities?
I did not.
So as far as you knew, the responsibility for discussing these matters with the President, obtaining his authority, was on the shoulders of Mr. McFarland and Vice Admiral Poindexter.
Yes,
Is that
sir.
correct? And you believe that they had indeed obtained that authority and
For those issues that would have required a presidential decision, yes, sir.
You testified that Colonel Dutton gave you a photograph album of the resupply effort, is that correct?
Colonel Dutton gave me a photo album that contained photographs of the efforts being made to resupply particularly the southern front, but also the northern front, and to a certain extent the Atlantic front. And those photos contain, or the album contained photographs, as I recall, taken at several different locations in Central America.
Illustrating the resupply effort.
Yes, sir.
And you told Colonel Dutton that you would take it to the top boss, meaning the President.
I told him that after he had shown me the photograph album, I told him that I thought that was something that the President ought to see, because I believed then, as I believe now, that the President should see the heroism of the young men that were assisting in this effort.
Whether the President ever saw the album or not?
I do not know.
You sent it up the line, so to speak, and as far as you know, the President may have seen it or may not. You don't know.
I do not know, sir.
Did Admiral Poindexter say anything to you when you gave him the photo album?
I don't recall that he did. I probably just sent it over with a normal package, probably in an envelope.
Do you know whether Admiral Poindexter ever got it? Did you ever discuss it with him?
As I recall, it was relatively close to the end of my tenure, and we were very engaged with the Iranian initiative at that time. I don't remember talking to him about it again.
The President ever talked to you about the album?
No, sir.
So you don't recall any conversation with either Admiral Poindexter or the President about the album?
I do not.
You told Colonel Dutton, while he wouldn't receive a medal for his work, but one day the President would shake his hand and thank him?
I told Colonel Dutton that I deeply believed, first of all, that he certainly wouldn't receive any medals, but that at some point in the future, all going well, the President would receive these people that had worked so hard and so long to support the Nicaraguan resistance. I believe that that's something that could have been arranged had it been successful.
You assume that the President knew about the resupply?
I'm sorry?
You assume the President knew about the resupply then? That's what.
Well, otherwise I wouldn't have made that kind of a suggestion.
Let me ask you about another matter. You had some contact with David Walker.
I did.
Who is David Walker?
David Walker is a British subject who runs a business in the Channel Islands.
He's a security specialist.
I'm sorry?
He's a international securities or international specialist in insurgency and military matters.
The firm that he represents or runs specializes in a number of activities like security assistance and the like, but I'm not entirely certain that we really want to go too far in this discussion in a public session.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that there has been a discussion of this matter with the testimony of General Sinlob, who testified, as I recall, that there was a contact between Colonel North and Mr. Walker for the purpose of carrying on certain activities, covert activities, specifically described by him in a general way in Central America. I'll be guided by the chairman's instruction on this.
Mr. Foley, I have no knowledge whatsoever that I can recall about a direct contact between Mr. Walker and General Singlov. And while I would feel comfortable in discussing this issue in an executive session, I don't feel particularly comfortable discussing it in open session. I think there are equities that belong to other governments that are at stake here.
May I suggest to my distinguished colleague to set this aside temporarily, and we will check this out with the proper authorities.
I'll do so, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarland testified that he told you not to solicit, encourage, or otherwise broker financial contributions to the Contras from foreign countries. You testified last week, I believe, that you could not recall such an instruction.
I don't want to characterize Mr. McFarland's testimony. When I was asked the question, had I been instructed accordingly, I said no. My testimony stands, sir.
So it's possible that there is a disagreement here between you and Mr. McFarland, but your relationships with Mr. McFarland were always on a professional basis. You admire him as a national security advisor, and
I do.
There's no reason for you to be otherwise at odds with his testimony, except on a fair basis of disagreement. Is that correct?
Mr. Foley, I have said numerous times in my testimony that I am not here to impugn the testimony of others, nor do I wish to characterize the testimony of others. I simply will tell you that I do not recall ever being instructed by Mr. McFarland to the directions that you have just indicated.
Colonel North, you've testified that there was above you the National Security Advisor and then in effect the President, except for perhaps one other deputy at one time, and that while you were never authorized directly by the President to carry out these activities that you've testified about over these last days, that you always believed that the President knew and approved. Would it trouble you if testimony or information develops that the President did in fact not know about critical National Security Council actions that you assume to be authorized?
Congressman Foley, that question has indeed been asked before in this. My testimony is on the record. I don't think it's fair to be asked what troubles me and what doesn't. And as I've already indicated, in some respects, these hearings trouble me. And therefore, I have testified as to the facts as I know them. And I mean no disrespect whatsoever, sir, but I think my presentation of the facts as they were known to me should stand as it is.
Well, you were familiar with the chain of command as an officer. If you found in the chain of command that it wasn't clear who authorized an order or how it was generated from higher authority, you would recognize that as a problem in the chain of command, wouldn't you?
Well, excuse me, sir, that's a hypothetical question. You're just asking him to speculate on what would occur if certain facts were in existence. He's testified to the facts.
No, I'm asking
he's demonstrated no uncertainty about his chain of command. The record is filled with documents which show that he reported to his superiors, and I don't think your question is a fair one, sir.
Well, let me put it this way, Counsel. We're trying to discover what Colonel North's advice is with respect to matters that he had an intimate knowledge about. We're trying to discover what went wrong in our national security planning. The committee's purpose here is not to bring this important witness before us, except to learn how we can correct the mistakes and deficiencies of the past. And he's an able officer who's been at the heart of these decisions and actions. And I think it is fair to ask him if he believes in the chain of command, whether or not we have a possible problem in the National Security Council staffing and operation if it appears, as it already, I suggest to you, Counsel, has appeared from the President's own statements, that he denies authorizing activities which this officer believed were authorized.
Well, sir, I understand what your purpose is. My suggestion is that hypothetical questions are not the way to approach it. The witness is here to provide you the facts. He's given you the facts. You have to draw those conclusions. That's your job.
Well, in other words, I think, Mr. Chairman, we have a suggestion here that while we can take advice from Colonel North in response to questions about what our policy should be in Central America, on legal questions of the constitutionality of certain acts, and a variety of other things, through the consul's objections, we're not going to get his answers about what he thinks is an appropriate line of command for national security staff. And
Sure.
It seems to me that that's
We can talk all day about this, Mr. Foley. I'm just asking that you not ask hypothetical questions as you did in the form you asked it. Why don't you try asking another question?
I'll ask this question. You didn't at any time receive...
Before proceeding, I'd like to advise my distinguished colleague that I've just been told by the committee counsel that the White House has declassified the David Walker material. So if you wish to use that, proceed, sir.
David Walker is an international arms and security specialist. Is a British subject, is that right?
That is my understanding, yes, sir.
Did you authorize or have any discussions with him regarding activities inside Nicaragua?
I did.
Did you authorize him to perform military actions in Nicaragua?
I did.
What were those actions?
David Walker was involved, his organization, as I understand it, in support of the Nicaraguan resistance with internal operations in Managua and elsewhere in an effort to improve the perception that the Nicaraguan resistance could operate anywhere that it so desired.
Involved so-called policies of intimidation, is that what we're talking about?
No, those were other activities that we talked about.
Talking about it, military actions, attacks on military aircraft of the
Yes, sir.
Sandinista government?
Yes.
Did you directly authorize that?
I didn't directly authorize anything. I encouraged Mr. Walker to be in touch with the people who could benefit from that, the expertise that he had.
Did you report that recommendation to Admiral Poindexter?
I did.
Did he approve it?
I reported what I thought was a good idea for certain expertise that the Nicaraguan resistance did not have as a consequence of insufficient training, insufficient operational capability.
Did he ever tell you he approved it?
He never told me not to.
He didn't tell you he disapproved it?
That's correct.
Do you know if the president was ever informed of it?
I do not know, sir.
Colonel North, do you believe that the president knew of the diversion of funds, or the residuals as you call them, from the Iranian arms sales to the president, to the Contras? You testified that you assumed that that was true, but you were told it was not true by Vice Admiral Poindexter and the president. Is that right?
That is correct, sir.
And yet, at the time you were doing it, you thought it was authorized.
I did.
And it apparently was not authorized.
The President of the United States told me so himself. The National Security Advisor told me so himself. I have no reason to disbelieve either one of them, sir.
Do you think it is appropriate, proper, to carry on an activity if the President does not authorize that activity and it's a major national security undertaking?
Congressman Foley, I have, going on 5 days now, testified to the effect that I believed that the President was aware. I fully reported my activities, sought approval from my superiors. I believe that there are certain circumstances in which my superiors could authorize activities. They did so.
Do you believe that Vice Admiral Poindexter is your superior, or Mr. McFarland, when he was the National Security Council advisor, is your superior, has the right to make these decisions in the absence of presidential authority?
Mr. Foley, I have consistently told you that I assumed that when it was appropriate, they sought the authorities that I had recommended and that they had obtained them, and therefore I proceeded.
Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude my time here. Because the counsel's advice to his client discourages his giving us advice, we are left with a decision to make, and the American people are left with a decision to make as to whether or not critical decisions of national security policy of this country involving far-reaching impacts on our foreign policy and defense policy can be properly undertaken in the National Security Council by a lieutenant colonel acting in response to the orders of or the acquiescence of Mr. McFarland or Vice Admiral Poindexter, and in the absence of presidential authority. In a few days, Vice Admiral Poindexter will be sitting in that seat, and we'll have to ask this question to him. But I think we're left with a disturbing problem that while every single matter of advice is being given by this officer on foreign policy, on national security policy, on his reactions to legal matters, what he knows most about, the internal activities of the National Security Council and his role with respect to his superiors, he will not, and the advice of counsel, give us his evaluation of whether there is not a deep defect and flaw in that policy apparatus if in fact the president did not know and these policies were carried on by his subordinates without his authority.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Please do.
Mr. Foley, what I deeply believe is that it is up to the executive, and in this case the President of the United States himself, to make whatever changes he deems appropriate in the functioning of his staff. I do not believe that, I did not believe then, and I do not believe now that it is within the purview of the legislative branch of our government to mandate those kinds of changes. That if the President sees fit to make changes in the order of his staff, the structure of his staff, the activities of his staff, then it is within his purview to do so.
I would remind you, Colonel, that the National Security Council itself and the staff that served it was created by law, by statute, not just by the President, but by the Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you very much. Senator Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator William Cohen of Maine, among other things, he supported aid for the Contras.
There are a number of items that have been left a bit unresolved in my mind. I'd like to touch upon them quickly if I could. Mr. Felix Rodriguez, also known as Max Gomez, testified before the committee. At one point, you and he were together and looked up at a television screen, and you said, "You see those guys up there," meaning members of Congress, "they're out to get me, but they're not going to get me because, words to the effect, the old man loves me." And I was wondering who the old man was.
I have absolutely no recall whatsoever of that conversation, Senator.
Second question.
I don't believe it ever happened.
All right. Second question, Senator Mitchell mentioned the Washingtonian Magazine, which is a fairly lengthy piece, and I think you indicated you don't have the time and did not read that article.
I read the captions on one photograph that was so erroneous as to be unbelievable, and that's where I stopped.
I just wanted to clarify that. At one point in the article itself, it indicated that you had stated that you had direct access to the president on at least one occasion without logging in, consistent with the record keeping. And that's
I never
false.
made any surreptitious visits to the president, sir.
And also, Time magazine. Again, many of us have been victimized by having anonymous sources quoted, and I'd like to just get your reaction for the record. But according to Time last week, it said that someone who was associated with you, on one occasion, you held up a copy of the Boland Law and said, "This is the law I'm violating and I could go to jail." And I think from your testimony yesterday, the day before, you said that's false.
It's hogwash, sir.
Did you ever have occasion to call the president of Costa Rica to threaten to cut off foreign assistance in the event that he held a press conference revealing the airstrip in Costa Rica?
I did not make the call. The prof's note to which you refer was specifically cast the way it was to protect the other two parties engaged.
So you never made the call yourself?
I did not.
I think you indicated earlier today, in the past 3 or 4 days, that you were prepared to take the hit, so to speak, From the time it started to come unravel, I think on November 21st, when the activity started in your office in terms of the increased shredding. And you prepared to take the fall in terms of any political damage. But that once on November 25th, I believe that's Tuesday, the Attorney General announced that an independent counsel was going to be appointed and target you, that you changed your mind at that point. You no longer were going to be the fall guy for the administration. Now, at that time, is that correct?
Well, first of all, the concept of a person who would be held responsible and take the political spear, if you will, began way back in 1984. On November 25th of 1986, I recognized for the very first time that someone really did consider this, all of what I had done, or at least the Iranian activities in which I had been engaged, to be some kind of a criminal act. And at that point, my perspective changed considerably.
Your mindset, I think you used the phrase, changed considerably, as it should. Now, after that disclosure, you went back to your office on that day and met your secretary at the office, and I think you were with your prior attorney, Mr. Green. Is that correct?
That is correct. And
certain documents were taken out of the office at that point.
I want to clarify the record on that. I had already, after the press conference, I removed documents from the White House, some of which I have just given to the committee in the last few days, and I subsequently removed documents later on in the evening when I returned to the White House.
But I mean, those documents that were taken out at that time that's been testified to by Ms. Hall and Ms. Hall, those documents.
You're talking about the later in the evening?
The ones that were taken out of your clothing. And perhaps I might just get the advice of counsel on this. Could you tell me what documents they were? What were the documents that were taken out or smuggled out that afternoon? And maybe counsel could advise me or the committee in terms of whether he would be able to respond to that.
No, sir, I'm not in a position of answering that kind of factual question.
Well, I asked only to find out whether or not that information or those documents have been returned to the committee or to the NSC. I believe there's some indication that documents were, in fact, returned at a subsequent time, and I was inquiring as to whether those were the documents returned.
My letter of December 2nd, 1986 indicates that documents were returned at that time. The documents which you have that bear the law firm's number stamp in the bottom right-hand portion of the documents are the documents that were returned.
Could I inquire as to whether those documents were for the purpose of either protecting the initiative or protecting yourself in terms of showing that you had higher authority at that point?
The original intent of gathering those documents was to destroy them. When I heard the announcement at noon, I removed some of those 168 pages of documents, and the remainder of them are the ones Ms. Hall removed from the office later that evening. And they were all returned to the White House.
Now, Colonel North, as I at least understand this case, and I've been listening to evidence since last November and December, I come away with a picture that you were charged, among many other things that you had to do, with running two essential railroads, as I've described it. Number one, you were charged with getting arms to the Iranians to further relations with the Iranians and hopefully to get our hostages out. And the second railroad that you were in charge of is keeping the heart and soul alive, getting money and or munitions to the Contras. And as it turned out, you had quite heroic undertakings, being engineer, conductor, perhaps even the fireman on both of those railroads. But at some point in time, namely between December and January, those two railroads that were running parallel started to merge. And they merged in the beginning of January of 1986 when you were approached by, I believe, Mr. Neer, who suggested that perhaps you could combine the two efforts and accomplish a killing of 2 or 3 birds with one stone. And then Mr. Gurbanifar elaborated specifically with reference to giving aid to the Contras. And I think you indicated that you thought it was a neat idea, some members of the committee do as well, that Bill Casey was enthusiastic, that Admiral Poindexter approved, and that you operated on the assumption that the president himself approved. I think that's clear from the evidence. And I must say that that notion has some rather surface appeal, the notion of twisting the tail of the Ayatollah in that fashion. But it seemed to me there were some other considerations, and I was wondering if they were taken into account. you indicated that the Iranians at that time were very distrustful of about everybody. I think you characterized them as being unsophisticated. They were angry at being scammed, I think is your word, by the Israelis back in November of '85. They were sort of on the ragged edge of rationality. They could kill the hostages at any time just by giving the word to their Lebanese captors. But in spite of this, we agreed to a program whereby we inflated the cost of those munitions 300% or 400%, and then we're going to use that residual margin for the Contras and other special programs. And the Iranians found out at some point that they were being gouged, and they complained rather bitterly about it, and then we were left with the only alternative of coming up with some phony price lists rather than try to reduce the price. And it occurs to me that didn't this run the very risk at the time when the Iranians were so sensitive about being gouged and taken advantage of and lied to by a host of people, at that very time that we would risk the lives of the hostages that you were very passionately concerned about, as evident from the record, by combining these two covert programs in that fashion?
It did, and we discussed that at length, Director Casey and I recall at least one occasion where the Admiral and I discussed it. The fact is that we knew that the Iranians would pay even more than we were charging from intelligence that we had gathered. We knew that during the first channel, for example, that Mr. Ghorbani Farr had a little frolic and diversion of his own going on, in which he had pocketed at least some for himself, if not for others, a considerable sum, and that even the prices we charged, he further inflated. And so we judged that risk to be minimum, given that they would basically pay whatever they could to get these items or weapons from the source, whatever source they could.
I'd like to clear up one other item. The money that was generated by the sales of the weapons to the Iranians, they were to be used for the Contras and other special purposes. And I think you've indicated very clearly that you had general control over the disposition of those funds. In other words, you could tell Mr. Secord, General Secord, Albert Hakim, so much, roughly so much for this program and so much for another, that you had the residual authority at least to control those funds. Did you indicate that yesterday?
Well, again, I don't like to use the word control because I never felt that I actually controlled a nickel of the funds. I did talk not to Mr. Hakim but to General Secord about the fact that, look, we need some money for this. General Secord would frequently point out to me, you've got to stop coming up with these unforeseen contingency requirements if we're going to run this, keep the Nicaraguan resistance alive, continue the Iranian initiative, and still do these other things that you come up with on very short notice.
But there's no doubt in your mind that had you directed that amount of money, a certain amount that had to go to the Contras, he would have agreed with that.
Well, again, I don't think it's right to say directed. There were frequently times when General Secord would point out that my expectations were unreasonably high and that I should be more considerate of the fact that there were other expenses engaged in this effort.
Chair recognizes Mr. Hyde.
Henry Hyde, 62 years old, member of the Foreign Affairs and Intelligence Committee from the state of Illinois.
Chairman.
We've seen a lot of him in these hearings.
Colonel North, I would like to direct your attention to an exhibit on the wall here, one that you had seen before from that other vantage point. It's the first one. It's entitled Public Law 98-473, October 12, 1984. It's the Boland Amendment, one of the 5 versions that was in effect then. And at the bottom of that exhibit is the signature of Thomas P. O'Neill, Speaker of the House, Strom Thurmond, President Pro Tem of the Senate, and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Do you see that up there?
I do, sir.
Now, that was presented to you the other day to make a point. And the point was that the President signed the Boland Amendment, that it is the law, and the President signed it. And of course, if the President signs it, why, who are we not to observe it because it's a law? Now, I was taken aback when I saw that because the purpose, it seemed to me, was to convey the impression that the President was sitting at his desk and someone put the Boland Amendment in front of him and he said, my God, give me my pen, I want to sign the Boland Amendment. Because that's a phony. That's a fabrication. That's contrived. The Boland Amendment is a couple of pages in this. This is the way it appeared to the president. It was brought to him 12 days after the fiscal year was over. The operations of government would have to close down if he didn't sign this. There were military appropriations, Social Security money, the Department of Interior. The Navy would have to bring the ships back to the dock and say to the sailors, hitchhike home. We have no money. We have no money, so we have to sign. Mr. President, you gotta sign this. So what the staff did, and I might suggest if I tried this in a municipal court in Chicago, phoning up an exhibit to make a point that was half true, I'd be held in contempt. But of course, we're in a hurry and we got to get there quickly, so we contrived and fabricated that to show the president signed it. Now I stipulate it is the law. The president did sign this, and by the way, here's his signature. It's the back page. The back page, yeah. And the president had to sign it because that's the way we legislate around here. The only thing we're here for largely is to spend the taxpayers' money, collect it and spend it. And you know how we do it? At midnight, after the fiscal year is over, when there's no time to debate or to understand, and we pass this massive glob of legislation where I challenge anybody in the building to know what's in all of it. I'm sure the chairman of the Armed Services knows what's in his chapter, and the judiciary knows what's in his chapter, but nobody, not even the staff, understands what's in here. And we vote for it because we got to be responsible. But I don't think we needed that shortcut. It seemed to me it was a little deceptive. And I just want to, for myself, nobody else, apologize that this committee, used a little deception on you. I won't ask that this be put in the record, Mr. Chairman. That would be overreaching, so I won't do that. Now, there's another exhibit up there, Colonel North. It's called, I call it the Hostage Rescue Act. It's right over there, and it's been the law since 1868. And under that law, by the way, it isn't just an old musty law in the parchments in the archives. This law was cited by President Carter, January 19th, 1981, when he was trying to get hostages out. And incidentally, promised to send $150 million worth of armaments, aircraft spare parts, if we could get our hostages out. So weapons for hostages is not unique with this administration. But in any event, he cited that law, and it seems to me correctly that under that law, if you assume that the Hezbollah is under the influence of Iran, and obviously you did, and the NSC did, because you were dealing with Iran to free the hostages. But under that law, it seems to me you don't need findings, you don't need LOAs, you don't need anything except the president's determination to get the hostages out. Now, the one thing he can't do is make war. And he does have to report to Congress as soon as practicable, but I assume that was when the hostages were released. But in any event, since we are so punctilious on the law, I think we keep missing that so much, and I just keep bringing it back to call your attention to it. Now, we've heard that a free nation cannot operate in a shroud of secrecy. That is one of the great testaments that we've learned from these hearings. A little bicentennial note again, because I'm kind of into the bicentennial. Our Constitution was fashioned in secrecy. It was shrouded in secrecy. Nobody was permitted to the debates. And the Bill of Rights was born in secrecy. And that's one of the problems. We don't really have many notes. We've got Madison's notes, which are incomplete, about what really went on in the Constitutional Convention. And the greatest triumph in diplomacy since I've served in Congress was Camp David. It was Jimmy Carter bringing Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat together, putting them in a room, locking the door. Secrecy, secrecy. So secrecy has its uses. I'm told that the Senate met in secret its first 10 years. Maybe it was the first 6. I'm trying to research it, but somehow or other they met in secret. A plan that I wouldn't recommend today. Now, you've been accused of shredding the Constitution, and that's serious.
I don't believe that was one of the documents that I shredded.
Well, I would say I'm sure you didn't shred that as a document, but symbolically. Let me put my own views on record, Colonel North. I think lying to Congress, I think arms for hostages, arms to Iran. I think operating the Contras support operation out of the White House was wrong, and I think the failure to confer with Congress was wrong, and we're paying a fearful price for that.